"Grandpa Joe, maybe you should consider moving to one of those senior communities. This neighborhood isn't what it used to be, and frankly, we're worried about your financial situation." My daughter-in-law Rebecca spoke these words while looking around my modest living room with barely concealed disgust, as if poverty might be contagious. "I'm Joseph Joe Martinez, 81 years old." And that moment perfectly captured how my wealthy family had been treating me for years. Like a charity case to be managed, rather than a patriarch to be respected. What they didn't know was that their poor old father was worth more than all of them combined. And I'd been quietly testing their character while they failed every examination. Let me tell you how. I lived as a supposed pauper among my prosperous children, and how the day I revealed my secret changed everything about our family dynamics forever. The misunderstanding about my wealth began 30 years ago when I made a decision that shaped the rest of my life. In 1993, at age 51, I sold my successful plumbing company for $2.8 million, a fortune by the standards of our working-class neighborhood. But instead of moving to a mansion or buying luxury cars, I chose to continue living exactly as I always had, in the same modest house, driving the same reliable vehicles, and maintaining the same simple lifestyle that had served me well. My late wife Carmen understood my reasoning. "Joe, money doesn't change who you are unless you let it," she'd said when I explained my decision to keep our wealth private. "Let's see how our children turn out when they think they have to earn their own success." Carmen and I agreed that we'd continue living modestly, save and invest wisely, and let our 3 children, Robert, Michelle, and David, build their own lives without the expectation of inherited wealth or family financial support beyond what any middle-class parents might provide. We paid for their college educations, helped with reasonable emergencies, and provided the same level of support that responsible parents of modest means typically offer their children. But we never revealed the extent of our assets, our investment portfolio, or the comfortable retirement we could have afforded. Our plan was to eventually share our wealth with the children when they were mature enough to handle it responsibly, and to use it to help with grandchildren's educations and family emergencies. But we wanted to see what kind of people our children would become when they believed success depended on their own efforts rather than family money. What we discovered over the years was both disappointing and illuminating. Robert became a successful orthopedic surgeon, married to Rebecca, a former pharmaceutical sales representative who'd never worked after their wedding. They lived in a 6,000 square foot house in the most exclusive suburb, drove luxury cars, and spent lavishly on vacations, private schools, and country club memberships. Michelle became a corporate attorney, married to James, an investment banker. They lived in a downtown penthouse, collected art, and moved in social circles where wealth was both assumed and displayed conspicuously. David chose academia, becoming a university professor, but he married Lisa, whose family owned a chain of furniture stores. While David's salary was modest, Lisa's family money provided them with a comfortable lifestyle in an upscale neighborhood near the university. All 3 of my children achieved success in their chosen fields, and all 3 married into families with significant wealth, but their prosperity seemed to make them forget their own modest origins and develop a sense of superiority toward people who lived the way they used to live. People like me. The transformation in their attitudes toward me became obvious after Carmen died 5 years ago. During her illness and after her funeral, their interactions with me shifted from respect and affection to something that felt more like patronizing charity. "Dad, we're worried about you managing this house all by yourself. Robert said during one of his increasingly infrequent visits. "The maintenance costs must be eating up your pension." "I'm managing fine, Robert. The house is paid off, and I keep up with repairs. But Dad, you're 76 years old. What happens when you need major work done? Do you have savings for a new roof or a furnace replacement?" These questions weren't asked out of genuine concern for my well-being. They were asked with the assumption that I was financially vulnerable and might need their assistance. Assistance they seemed reluctant to provide. Rebecca was more direct in her assessment of my situation. "Joe, this neighborhood really has declined since you and Carmen first moved here. Some of these houses are practically falling apart. Don't you want to live somewhere ... nicer? This is my home. Rebecca, Carmen, and I raised our family here. I understand the sentimental value, but sentiment doesn't increase property values or improve security. You could probably get a decent price for this place and move to a senior community, where you'd have social activities and meal programs." Meal programs? As if I couldn't afford to feed myself. Michelle's approach was more subtle but equally condescending. She'd visit occasionally and bring expensive gifts that felt more like charity than generosity. "Dad, I brought you some steaks from that gourmet market downtown. I thought you might enjoy something special." "Michelle, I can buy my own steaks." "I know you can, Dad, but these are really high quality. I just thought, well, I know you're careful with your spending, and everyone deserves a treat once in a while." The implication was clear. I was living frugally out of necessity rather than choice, and my successful children were graciously supplementing my limited resources with occasional luxuries I couldn't afford myself. David's wife, Lisa, was the most openly dismissive of my lifestyle and choices. "Joe, David and I were talking, and we think you should consider getting a financial advisor. Someone who could help you manage your fixed income more effectively and maybe suggest some cost-cutting measures. I manage my finances just fine. Lisa, I'm sure you do your best, but there are professionals who specialize in helping seniors make their money stretch. David's worried that you might be house-rich but cash-poor, and that could create problems if you have a medical emergency." These conversations revealed that my children had developed a specific narrative about my financial situation. I was an elderly man living on a modest pension and social security, struggling to maintain a house I couldn't really afford, too proud to ask for help, but clearly in need of their guidance and occasional assistance. What they couldn't see, because they'd never bothered to look closely, was that I lived modestly by choice, not necessity. My house was small but meticulously maintained. My car was older but reliable and well cared for. My clothes were simple but quality pieces that I'd had tailored and kept in excellent condition. I wasn't struggling to pay bills or skipping meals or delaying medical care. I was simply living according to the same values that had served me well throughout my life, avoiding waste, appreciating what I had, and not using material possessions to define my worth or status. But my children had become so accustomed to equating wealth with virtue and poverty with failure, that they couldn't imagine choosing simplicity when you could afford complexity. The breaking point came during my 80th birthday party, which my children organized at Robert's house rather than asking where I'd like to celebrate. "Dad, we thought it would be nice to have your birthday here since our house is bigger and more comfortable," Robert explained. "Plus, Rebecca's been wanting to host a family gathering." The party was elegant, expensive, and completely impersonal. Rebecca had hired caterers, decorated with flowers that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, and invited her own friends along with family members, turning my birthday into a social event for her social circle. "Joe, You must be so proud of your children," one of Rebecca's friends said to me as I sat in a corner watching the party happen around me, rather than for me. "They've all done so well for themselves. It must give you such peace of mind to know they can take care of themselves. And it's so generous of them to include you in their lifestyle," another friend added. "Not every family makes sure their elderly parents get to experience nice things." The implication was that my children were being charitable by allowing me to attend a fancy party in their world, as if I were a grateful recipient of their generosity rather than the father they were supposedly honoring. But the conversation that finally pushed me to action happened when I overheard Rebecca talking to Michelle in the kitchen. "Michelle, we need to have a serious conversation about your father's living situation. The house is becoming a liability, and he's too stubborn to admit he needs help." "What kind of help are you thinking about?" "Well, James and I have been researching assisted living communities. There are some very nice places that aren't too expensive, and they provide meals, social activities, and medical monitoring. It would be perfect for someone in Joe's situation." "Does Dad want to move to assisted living?" "Michelle, what Dad wants and what Dad needs are two different things. He's 80 years old, living alone in a declining neighborhood, clearly struggling financially but too proud to ask for help. At some point, the family has to make responsible decisions." "What does Robert think?" "Robert agrees that something needs to be done. We can't just wait until Dad has a medical emergency or a financial crisis. We need to be proactive. And how would we afford a nice assisted living facility?" "Well, that's where it gets complicated. Dad would have to sell his house to pay for it, and honestly, I'm not sure that house is worth enough to cover more than a few years of care. We might have to supplement the cost." The way Rebecca said supplement the cost made it clear that she viewed this as an unwelcome financial burden, rather than a loving family responsibility. "Rebecca, are you suggesting we force Dad to sell his house and move somewhere he doesn't want to live?" "I'm suggesting we convince him it's in his best interest." "Michelle, your father is becoming a burden on all of us. Every family gathering becomes a guilt trip about how we're not doing enough for him, how we don't visit enough, how we don't include him enough. If he was in a facility with other people his age, he'd have his own social life and wouldn't depend on us for entertainment." That word, burden, crystallized everything I'd been feeling about my children's attitude toward me. They saw me as an obligation to be managed rather than a father to be cherished. But they also saw me as financially dependent rather than financially independent, which gave me an idea for how to teach them the most important lesson of their lives. The next day, I called my financial advisor, Kenneth Walsh, who'd been managing my investments for over 20 years. "Ken, I need to ask you a favor. I want to arrange a family meeting where my children learn the truth about my financial situation, but I want to do it in a way that makes them understand how their assumptions about my poverty have affected our relationships. Joe, are you sure about this? Once they know you're wealthy, everything will change." "Ken, everything already has changed. They treat me like a charity case who should be grateful for their attention. I want them to understand that respect shouldn't depend on bank account balances." Ken and I developed a plan that would reveal my financial situation in a way that forced my children to confront their own attitudes about money, class, and family obligation. I invited all 3 children and their spouses to my house for what I called an important family discussion about my future. I told them I'd been thinking about their suggestions regarding my living situation and financial management, and that I wanted their input on some decisions I needed to make. They arrived expecting to guide me through discussions about downsizing, my lifestyle, and accepting their help with managing my limited resources. Instead, they found Ken sitting at my dining room table with a stack of financial documents and a presentation that would shatter every assumption they'd made about my circumstances. "Kids, I asked Ken to join us today because it's time you learned the truth about my financial situation," I began. "You've all been operating under some misconceptions that have affected how you treat me and how you think about our family relationships." Robert looked confused. "Dad, what kind of misconceptions?" "The misconception that I'm poor, Robert. The misconception that I'm struggling to maintain this house and living on a fixed income that barely covers my expenses." Ken opened his portfolio and began laying out documents that told a very different story than the one my children had assumed. "Your father's current net worth is approximately $8.2 million, Ken announced matter-of-factly. "This includes his investment portfolio, real estate holdings, cash accounts, and other assets." The silence that followed was profound. $8 million. Michelle whispered. "Your father has been one of my most successful clients," Ken continued. "He sold his plumbing business in 1993 for $2.8 million and has been investing wisely ever since. His portfolio has averaged 12% annual returns over the past 30 years. Rebecca's face had gone completely white. "Joe, if you have $8 million, why are you living like this?" "Like what, Rebecca?" "Like a normal person who doesn't need to display his wealth to feel valuable." David was the first to grasp the implications. "Dad, you've been testing us. You've been watching how we treated you when we thought you were poor." "That's exactly what I've been doing, David. And the results have been very educational." I walked to my kitchen and returned with a folder containing printouts of conversations I'd overheard. Notes about their comments about my lifestyle, and records of their suggestions about my living situation and financial management. "For 5 years, you've treated me like a burden, a charity case. Someone whose opinions don't matter because you assume I don't have the resources to back up my preferences." I read them some of their own quotes. Rebecca's comments about my neighborhood, Michelle's assumptions about my spending limitations, Robert's suggestions about senior communities, Lisa's recommendations for financial advisors to help me stretch my limited income. "Dad, we were trying to help," Robert said weakly. "No, Robert, you were trying to manage what you saw as a problem. The difference is that helping involves asking what someone needs and respecting their autonomy. Managing involves making assumptions about what someone needs and pressuring them to accept your solutions." "But Dad, why didn't you just tell us you were wealthy?" Michelle asked. "Because I wanted to see what kind of people you'd become when you thought I couldn't do anything for you financially. I wanted to know if you'd respect me for who I am rather than what I can provide." Ken presented additional information that made the lesson even more pointed. "Your father could afford to live anywhere he wants," Ken explained. "He could buy a mansion, travel the world, hire full-time staff. He chooses to live modestly because he values simplicity and doesn't measure his worth by his possessions." "But that's not normal," Lisa protested. "People with money usually live like they have money." "Lisa, what's not normal is treating someone differently based on how much money you think they have," I replied. "What's not normal is assuming that someone's worth as a person depends on their bank balance." The revelations continued as Ken detailed my charitable giving, my investments in local businesses, and my quiet financial support for various community projects. "Your father has donated over $400,000 to local charities over the past 10 years," Ken revealed. He's also provided anonymous scholarships for disadvantaged students and funded improvements to the community center in this neighborhood you've all criticized. Dad, you could have told us you were doing all that, David said. We would have been proud of your generosity. Would you, David? Or would you have tried to manage my charitable giving the same way you tried to manage my living situation? Would you have suggested more appropriate charities that aligned with your social circles? The conversation continued for 3 hours, during which my children had to confront some uncomfortable truths about how their prosperity had changed their values and their treatment of people they perceived as less successful. The hardest part, I told them as the meeting wound down, wasn't being treated like I was poor. The hardest part was being treated like being poor would make me less worthy of respect, less capable of making good decisions, less valuable as a family member. Dad, we never meant to make you feel that way, Michelle said, tears in her eyes. Michelle, impact matters more than intent. The impact of your behavior was that I felt dismissed, patronized, and reduced to a problem to be solved, rather than a father to be loved. But the story doesn't end with my revelation, because the real test was what my children would do with this new information. Some of them rose to the occasion. David, surprisingly, was the most thoughtful in his response. Dad, I need to apologize. Not just for how we treated you, but for what our treatment reveals about our own values. We became the kind of people who judge others based on their wealth, and that's not who you raised us to be. David made genuine efforts to change how he interacted with me, asking for my opinions, including me in decisions, and treating me like the patriarch of the family rather than a dependent relative. Michelle struggled more with the revelation, but eventually came to understand the lesson I'd been trying to teach. Dad, I realize now that I was embarrassed by your lifestyle because I thought it reflected poorly on our family's success. I was treating you the way I'd treat any elderly person I perceived as poor, which says terrible things about my character. Michelle began volunteering with senior services programs and discovered that many elderly people living modestly were doing so by choice rather than necessity, and that their wisdom and experience were valuable regardless of their bank balances. But Robert and Rebecca had the most troubling response to my revelation. Rather than recognizing the lesson about respect and dignity, they became angry that I'd tricked them and resentful that I'd judged their behavior. Dad, this whole thing was manipulative, Rebecca said during a follow-up conversation. You set us up to fail a test we didn't know we were taking. Rebecca, treating people with respect shouldn't require a test. It should be automatic. But you deliberately misled us about your financial situation. How were we supposed to know how to treat you? The same way you'd treat me if I actually was poor, with love, respect, and dignity. Robert was equally defensive. Dad, if you wanted us to treat you differently, you should have communicated that directly, instead of playing games. Robert, the fact that you think treating me with respect depends on my bank balance is exactly the problem I was trying to address. The revelation ultimately strengthened my relationships with David and Michelle, while revealing that Robert and Rebecca were exactly the kind of people I'd suspected they might be, people whose respect for others was conditional on wealth and status. Today, 2 years after my revelation, my relationship with my children reflects their true characters rather than their assumptions about my financial situation. David visits regularly, asks for my advice, and includes me in family decisions because he values my wisdom and experience. He's also become more conscious of how wealth can corrupt values and is raising his children to respect people regardless of their economic circumstances. Michelle has become one of my closest companions, joining me for weekly dinners and including me in her social activities, not because she feels obligated, but because she genuinely enjoys my company. She's also started volunteering with organizations that serve elderly people, and has become an advocate for treating seniors with dignity, regardless of their financial resources. Robert and Rebecca maintain polite but distant relationships with me. They're no longer condescending, but they're also not genuinely warm or inclusive. I suspect they're still resentful about being tested, and can't forgive me for revealing their true attitudes about class and wealth. But perhaps, most importantly, I've used my financial resources to support causes and organizations that reflect my values rather than hiding my wealth out of some misguided attempt to test people indefinitely. I've established a foundation that provides financial support for elderly people who choose to remain in their homes rather than moving to senior communities. I've funded programs that connect young people with elderly mentors, regardless of the mentor's economic circumstances. And I've donated to organizations that advocate for dignity and respect for all elderly people, not just those with family wealth to support them. Joe, do you regret the way you handled the revelation? Ken asked me recently. No, Ken. I learned exactly what I needed to learn about my children's characters. I also learned that hiding wealth is just as corrupting as displaying it. If you're doing it to manipulate or test people, what would you do differently? I'd probably be more direct about my values and expectations from the beginning. But I wouldn't change the lesson about treating people with respect, regardless of their financial circumstances. The secret I kept for 30 years wasn't really about money, it was about character. I wanted to know if my children would love and respect me when they thought I had nothing to offer them financially. I wanted to know if their success had made them forget the values Carmen and I had tried to teach them about treating all people with dignity. Some of them passed that test, and some of them didn't. But all of them learned something important about themselves and about the difference between conditional respect and unconditional love. My family thought I was poor, and their treatment of me revealed who they really were as people. The day my secret was revealed changed everything, not because I had money, but because they finally had to confront their own attitudes about what makes a person worthy of love and respect. Sometimes, the most valuable inheritance you can leave your children isn't money, but the self-knowledge that comes from understanding their own character. And sometimes the most important lesson an elderly person can teach is that dignity and worth aren't determined by bank balances, but by how you treat others when you think they have nothing to offer you in return. Money reveals character, both in how you handle having it and in how you treat people who you think don't have it. My secret taught my family more about themselves than any amount of inherited wealth ever could have. How do you think wealth affects family relationships? Have you ever been treated differently based on people's assumptions about your financial situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the most important test of character is how we treat people when we think they can't benefit us in return. If this story made you think about respect, dignity, and the role of money in family dynamics, please subscribe for more stories about family relationships, character tests, and the difference between conditional and unconditional love. From what city are you watching today?